Talking about sex has always been a taboo. But it wasn't always like this. In the Middle Ages, sex was talked about and lived more openly. It was during the Victorian era that repression took hold. Sexuality was hidden behind closed doors and became a secret. Talking about sex became a sin. The philosopher Michel Foucault questioned this idea. He argued that they didn't silence us completely, on the contrary. We started talking more about sex, but under strict rules. Doctors, psychologists, and the church controlled how we thought and spoke about sex. Foucault teaches us that power doesn't silence, power organizes what we say. Today, we continue breaking chains and discovering that sex is part of our humanity. Talking about sex is not a crime, it is freedom. Sexuality hasn't always meant the same thing throughout history. While today we believe our thoughts about sex are natural or universal, they are actually a social construct. What does this mean? It means that ideas about sexuality change according to time, culture, and the rules of each society. In the Middle Ages, for example, sex was seen as a part of everyday life. People talked about it without much shame, and there was even less control over what was considered right or wrong. But this changed. In the 19th century, with the Industrial Revolution and the Victorian era, sexuality began to be repressed. It became a forbidden topic, something only discussed in private. Society decided there were norms for sex. Speaking about it freely was seen as a sin or something immoral. This is where Michel Foucault, a French philosopher, comes in to show us something very interesting. He said, "Sexuality is not something natural, it's an idea we've constructed. And this idea was created by society to control us." For example, during the Victorian era, doctors and experts began to define what type of sexuality was normal and what was incorrect. This is when labels like heterosexual, homosexual, perverse, and many others were born. Why did they do this? According to Foucault, power needed to control people's bodies and minds. The repression of sexuality was not only to forbid, but also to observe and classify. The more hidden sex was, the more obsessed society became with studying and regulating it. Today, things have changed. We talk more openly about sexuality. Many people are breaking free from the labels and norms of the past, but we are still within a system where ideas about sex are imposed by culture. For example, why do we believe that certain sexual orientations are correct and others are not? Why are there expectations about how men and women should behave? Understanding this gives us freedom. It allows us to question what we've been taught and decide for ourselves what sexuality means. There is no single way to live it, because each society and each era has seen it differently. The next time someone tells you what is normal or abnormal, remember, the rules about sexuality were not always there. They were created. We've been told that the Victorian era was the time when sex disappeared. That society back then prohibited talking about sex, and everything was silence and repression. But what if I told you this is a myth? Michel Foucault, one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century, tells us that sexuality wasn't actually suppressed. Instead, it began to be obsessively studied and controlled. During the 19th century, society seemed to silence discussions about sex, but at the same time, it couldn't stop talking about it. Doctors, psychiatrists, and religious figures continuously wrote and spoke about what kind of sexuality was considered correct and which was deviant. Sex ceased to be something natural and everyday, becoming a subject that needed to be classified and controlled. Foucault calls it the myth of sexual repression. What does it consist of? The idea that power silenced us and prohibited us from talking about sex is false. What it really did was control it more intensely than ever. While it seemed like everything was silent, in reality, there was an obsession with monitoring and regulating people's sexuality. It was during this time that many labels emerged. They began to define who was normal and who was not, what types of desires were acceptable and which ones were considered perverse. For example, if someone felt attraction to the same gender, they were labeled and studied as a medical problem. Thus, what seemed like repression was actually a method to observe, diagnose, and control people's sexual lives. So, what can we learn from this? First, that sexuality was not repressed, it was organized and controlled. Second, that the labels and norms around sex are social constructs, not absolute truths. Questioning this system is the first step toward freeing ourselves and understanding that each person can live their sexuality in a free and unique way. When we think of power, we often imagine kings, governments, and leaders telling us what to do. But Michel Foucault showed us that power is not always visible. Power also controls our ideas, our words, and even our bodies. A clear example of this is sexuality. In the 19th century, sexuality was organized and controlled. Power did not want to eliminate it, but to dominate it. How did it do this? By creating norms about what was right and what was wrong, by defining labels to classify people, by monitoring and studying the behavior of each individual. For example, people who did not follow the rules about sex were seen as sick or sinful. In this way, power punished those who deviated from the norm. For Foucault, power doesn't only operate through laws and punishments. It also works in subtle ways. It tells us what is normal and what is not. It makes us feel guilt for what we desire. It forces us to monitor others and ourselves. Foucault explains that power and sexuality are connected through institutions such as the family, which teaches how men and women should behave, the church, which defines what is sinful, medicine, which classifies sexuality as either healthy or sick. These institutions use sexuality to establish rules and ensure that people followed them. But why is power so interested in controlling sexuality? Foucault would say that power needs order. By controlling sexuality, power organizes people, classifies them, and limits them. For example, we are told how we should love, how we should desire, and how we should behave. If someone breaks those rules, they are labeled, excluded, or punished. This control makes people monitor themselves and follow the norms without anyone directly telling them. This is what Foucault calls disciplinary power. But power is not invincible. If we understand how it works, we can question it and free ourselves. Sexuality should not be a tool for controlling people. It is something personal, something that each individual can live in their own way, without fear and without guilt. For centuries, people have felt the need to confess their deepest secrets. But have you ever wondered why we do it? Michel Foucault explains that confession didn't always exist as we know it today. It was born as a tool of control, where power not only wanted to know what we did, but also what we thought and felt. Confession began in the Catholic Church. Priests would ask people to confess their sins to cleanse their souls, but confession wasn't just about actions. Power wanted to know everything, what you desired, what you thought, what you dreamed. In this way, people began to self-explore, seeking answers about what they carried within. Over time, confession went from being a religious practice to a scientific one. In the 19th century, doctors and psychologists adopted confession as a tool for study. People no longer confessed their sins, but their desires, traumas, and hidden thoughts. This is where the idea was born that talking about ourselves is the key to understanding who we are and solving our problems. Foucault says that confession became something mandatory. Society taught us that we must talk about everything we feel to be healthy, and normal people. If something worries us, we must confess it. If something gives us pleasure, we must explain it. If something doesn't fit within the norms, we must justify it. Today, we live in a society where confessing our thoughts and feelings has become something public. We post what we think on social media. We share our emotions with strangers. We seek answers about who we are and why we feel what we feel. But is this freedom? Foucault would say no. In reality, we are still playing by the rules of power. We observe ourselves and confess, because we believe that by doing so, we will be understood and accepted. Confession and self-exploration are not inherently bad. They can help us get to know ourselves better, but only if we understand why we do them. Do you do it to be free? Or because you feel society forces you to explain yourself? True freedom lies in recognizing who you are without feeling compelled to justify it. Talking about yourself is not always freedom. Choose when and how you want to explore yourself. For a long time, childhood sexuality has been a taboo subject. Adults have preferred to ignore or repress it, thinking that children are pure beings with no desires. But Michel Foucault tells us something important: sexuality exists at all stages of life, including childhood. In the 18th century, the family became the center of social control. The home was not just a place to live, it was also a space to monitor and correct the behavior of its members, especially children. Childhood sexuality began to be seen as a danger that needed to be controlled. Parents and institutions prohibited any expression of curiosity or desire, fearing it would corrupt the children. This is where science comes into play. Doctors, psychologists, and educators began to closely monitor childhood sexuality. Any unusual behavior was studied and classified. Children who broke the rules were treated as abnormal or sick. Foucault explains that this was a way of exercising power. The family and science joined forces to monitor children and ensure they grew up within what was considered correct. But why control the sexuality of children? Foucault says that sexuality is a powerful tool. If power controls sexuality from childhood, it can shape individuals from their earliest years. Rules are taught about what is right and what is wrong. Feelings of guilt are created for any natural curiosity. Children learn to monitor themselves and hide what they feel. Today we know that repressing childhood sexuality is not the solution. A child's curiosity is not dangerous, it is natural. What is dangerous is creating an environment of fear and silence, where children cannot talk, ask questions, or understand their bodies. Extreme control not only represses sexuality, it also affects the way individuals perceive themselves as they grow. Foucault invites us to question the norms we have inherited. If we understand that the control over childhood sexuality is part of a system of power, we can begin to change it. It's not about eliminating boundaries, but about creating an environment where children can grow without guilt and with a healthy understanding of their bodies and emotions. Respect and education are the key. Curiosity is not the problem, silence is. For centuries, sexual norms have been imposed to control people. These norms tell us what is correct, what is accepted, and what we should hide, but where there is control, resistance is always born. Michel Foucault teaches us that sexual norms are not natural, they are social creations that can be challenged and changed. Resistance to sexual norms began when people dared to talk about what was once forbidden. Women who fought for the right to speak about their pleasure and decide about their bodies. Sexual minorities who refused to live in the shadows and demanded recognition. Couples who broke the molds imposed by family and religion. Foucault explains that power cannot exist without resistance. There will always be individuals or groups who rise to challenge the established norms. In the 20th century, a great sexual revolution emerged. people began to openly talk about topics like pleasure, the body, and identity. Movements defending the rights of LGBTQ people emerged. Women fought for their sexual freedom and the right to decide about their bodies. These resistances changed history because they proved that sexual norms are not immutable. Today, we continue resisting. Sexual norms still exist, but more and more people are daring to break them, individuals exploring their identity without fear of judgment, communities defending love in all its forms, people openly discussing topics like sexuality, gender, and consent. Resistance isn't always a massive protest. Sometimes, it's simply being yourself in a world that wants you to conform to the normal. Foucault teaches us that resisting doesn't mean destroying. Resisting means questioning what is imposed on us and deciding how we want to live. Sexual norms don't define us. What defines us is the freedom to express who we are and how we love, without feeling guilty or ashamed. Understanding our sexuality is understanding who we are. Resistance is more than an act of rebellion, it is an act of self-love.